I came across Big Fork Brands recently, and it's become one of those finds you actually want to tell people about, and you don't find that often. Okay. They're doing bacon sausage, plus these really solid pork jerky snacks and Chicago style sauces. Basically, upgrade anything you throw them on burgers, hot dogs, fries, throw it on there. It works.
But I bet it's packed full of junk.
Actually, it's made with clean ingredients and real care. That's small batch with no shortcuts, and people are obsessed with the flavor. You can go over to bigforkbrands.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout, and get 20% off anything on the site.
You can find the link and our code in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William,
And I'm Kat,
and that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity wherever you go.
Absolutely. I know we danced around this a little bit during our History of Money episode. We talked a little bit about it and our storyboards when we were talking about the things we want to do from like China and stuff. And anyway, here we go. The history of paper. What do you think?
Yes,
All right. All right. So let me see if I can set it up. Or do you want to do it?
I can do it.
Go for it.
So there's an object so common, so ordinary that most people never even think about it. You touch it every day. You trust it without question. It holds your money, your memories, your knowledge, your hygiene, and even maybe your history.
Paper?
Absolutely.
So take it away. And things began to, well, unravel quickly because you're not going to have books, receipts, currency, tissue, paper towels, and even in a digital world, paper, well, it is everywhere. It's everything. It's like a foundation you only notice, well, when it's not there.
But paper didn't always exist. But for most of human history, writing meant carving into stone, scratching onto clay, or painting on the walls.
Painting on
Knowledge,
the walls, you say? With
yes, paint.
like soot, blood, stuff.
Possibly, hopefully, I would prefer berries, you know, some sort of paint that they could create out of maybe probably said things you mentioned. Knowledge was heavy, it was fragile, and it was limited. Then something changed. A material appeared that was light, flexible, and surprisingly durable. It could be made from plants, it could be reproduced, and it could travel. Once it did, it really reshaped civilization. This is the story of paper, where it came from, how it spread, and how it became one of the most important inventions in human history.
So before paper, there was a problem because communication had, well, literally weight. And that weight, well, it kind of shaped what humans could record, preserve, and share. Because stone tablets, well, solved one problem, but created another. They were durable. They could last generations, even civilizations. But that durability came at a cost. They were heavy, difficult to transport, and slow to produce. Even inscription required carving into solid material, a process that, well, it really discouraged anything beyond essential records. Writing was not a casual act, it was more deliberate, labor intensive, and reserved for what really mattered the most.
Clay tablets offered a different approach. They could be formed while wet, inscribed with a stylus, and then hardened through drying or baking. This made them easier to produce than stone, and in places like Mesopotamia, they supported early systems of record keeping. But they did come with their own fragility. They could break, crumble, or be damaged by moisture, and while they allowed for more writing, they were still physically bulky. Large archives became literal rooms filled with stacks of fragile objects. In ancient Egypt, though, a more elegant solution emerged papyrus.
Papyrus was created from, well, the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly along the Nile River. The inner pith of the plant was cut into thin strips laid in overlaying layers. It was then pressed together and dried into sheets. This created a writing surface that was, well, it was lighter and more flexible than stone or clay, and it could be rolled into scrolls, making storage and transport a lot easier than trying to, you know, have those stone tablets on your back, trying to like walk around the desert.
But papyrus also had limits that shaped its use. It was sensitive to moisture and could deteriorate in humid environments. It also depended on a specific ecological region. Outside of Egypt, it was difficult to produce at scale, which made supply uneven and expensive in distant markets. Elsewhere, though, another material took hold, which was parchment.
Parchment was made from processed animal skins, and it was strong, durable, and far more stable over time than papyrus. It could withstand handling, folding, and long storage, but it too came with a significant cost because processing parchment required animal resources and extensive preparation. A single book, well, it might require dozens of skins, sometimes even more. That meant writing remained expensive, very expensive during the time, and it was slow, and the material, well, it was intensive. Across these systems, a pattern remained constant. Writing was constrained by the physical burden of its materials.
Knowledge existed, but it was heavy. It could be preserved, but not easily expanded. It could be stored, but not freely circulated. So the fundamental problem persisted across civilizations. How do you create a writing material that is affordable, portable, and scalable at the same time? Now, that answer did not come from refining stone, clay, plant strips, or animal skins. It came from rethinking the material entirely. Instead of treating writing surfaces as something to be carved, layered, or stretched, a different approach emerged.
What if the material itself was broken down completely, reduced to its smallest usable components, and then rebuilt into something new? Not carved, not assembled, but reformed. From fibers that were suspended in water, reorganized into sheets. And that shift in thinking changed everything that came after it.
So, around 105 CE, during the Han Dynasty, a Chinese court officially named Cai Lun refined and standardized what is widely recognized as the first true paper. It's important to note that forms of proto-paper likely existed before him, but Cai Lun's contribution was in systemizing the process and presenting it to the imperial court as a reliable, repeatable method. That distinction matters. He didn't just invent paper, he made it scalable.
His method was, well, it was simple, but chemically and mechanically sophisticated for its time. He gathered materials like mulberry bark, hemp fibers, worn out cloth rags, and even old fishing nets. These weren't random choices. Each material contained cellulose fibers, the structural backbone of plant matter. The process, well, it unfolded in stages. First, the raw materials were soaked in water to kind of soften them up and start breaking them down into their structure. Then they were beaten, sometimes with wooden mallets, into fibrous pulp. This step was it was critical. It separated the fibers so they could later be recombined into a new form.
That pulp was mixed with water to create a suspension, essentially a slurry of floating fibers.
That sounds disgusting, by the way.
It does.
Yeah, a slurry. Never gonna look at a flurry again the same way.
Next came the defining step. A screen or mold, typically made of bamboo, was dipped into the mixture and lifted out horizontally. As the water drained through the screen, the fibers were left behind, settling into a thin, even layer. But the real magic happened at the microscopic level. As the water drained away, the cellulose fibers naturally bonded together through hydrogen bonding. No glue was needed, and the fibers locked into each other, forming a flexible but cohesive sheet. The sheet was then pressed to remove excess water and dried. often against a flat surface, which helped smooth and strengthen it.
What emerged was something fundamentally new. Unlike papyrus, which relied on layering strips of plant material, or parchment, which depended on, treated animal skins, this was reconstituted material. It wasn't assembled, it was formed. The result had several advantages. It was lightweight, making it easier to transport, because stone would be heavy. This would be a little bit lighter. It was relatively inexpensive, especially when made from recycled materials like rags. It was easier to produce in larger quantities compared to parchment, and it was adaptable because the thickness, texture, and quality, well, it could be adjusted depending on how it was made.
So it also interacted with ink well. Instead of ink sitting on the surface or bleeding uncontrollably, paper absorbed it just enough to hold clean lines. This made it ideal for writing, drawing, and eventually printing. Sheets could be rolled into scrolls, folded into early book forms, or stacked and stored with far greater efficiency than earlier materials allowed. Now, at first, paper was primarily used within government administration and scholarly environments. It supported record keeping, official documents, and intellectual work, but as production techniques improved and materials became more accessible, its use expanded beyond elite circles.
And that expansion marked a turning point because once paper became more widely available, information itself became, well, more mobile. Ideas could travel farther, faster, and in greater volume. Because could you imagine trying to get on your pony and ride that stone tablet away? The
No.
clanking together would probably just break it into like rocks,
Oh my
right?
God. Could you imagine just accidentally tripping and then them falling or clanking
Oh
together in your
man,
freaking satchel and hearing the smash?
I had the Emperor's decree right here. So knowledge was no longer anchored to heavy tablets or raw materials. It was moving, and when it started moving, it began to reshape the world.
Paper didn't just replace older materials, it quietly rewired how people worked, thought, and organized their world. In China, its impact was immediate and structural. The imperial government depended on record keeping, taxes, census data, legal rulings, military orders, land ownership, and all of it required documentation. Before paper, maintaining these records was slow, expensive, and physically demanding.
So, with paper, bureaucracy, well, it really could expand. Officials could produce and store far more documents than ever before. Reports could be copied, distributed across, well, vast distances. Communication between regional governments and the capital, it became faster and more consistent. This mattered in a country as large as China because paper, well, it really helped transform the government from something that was localized and fragmented into something more centralized and coordinated. It didn't just support bureaucracy, it made it scalable.
Scalable.
Scalable, yeah.
So, paper also reshaped education. Text that once required immense labor to reproduce became easier to copy. Scholars could maintain personal collections, teachers could share materials more widely. Written knowledge became less tied to a single physical object and more like something that could exist in multiple places at once. This didn't create mass literacy overnight, but it lowered the barriers.
Confucian text, historical records, philosophical works, well, they could all circulate more freely within educated circles. Over time, this contributed to a more stable intellectual tradition where ideas could be preserved, compared, and built upon. Paper turned learning into something that could accumulate. It also opened the door to entirely new forms of expression.
Calligraphy, already valued in Chinese culture, evolved into a refined art form. The brush, ink, and paper combination allowed for subtle variation in stroke, pressure, and movement. So writing became visual as well as linguistic. Painting benefited as well. Artists could experiment more freely on paper than on heavier or more expensive materials. Landscapes, portraits, and abstract works became more accessible to produce and share. Then came early printing techniques.
Woodblock printing allowed entire pages to be carved into wooden blocks. They would then be inked and pressed onto paper. This was a major step in reproducing text at scale. While still labor intensive, it wasn't as labor intensive as handwriting documents. Paper made this possible. Without a flexible, absorbent surface, printing, well, it wouldn't have worked. And at this point, paper was no longer just a practical solution. It had become a medium. It carried government authority, preserved intellectual thought, and enabled artistic expression. It connected distant regions and different generations. And when a material reaches that level of integration, it rarely stays confined to one place or to one culture. It began to spread, not just as a product, but as the idea.
So, for several centuries, paper remained largely an East Asian technology, but that changed in 751 CE during the Battle of Talis. Chinese papermakers were captured by forces of the Abbasid Caliphate. With them came the knowledge of how paper was made. From there, paper production spread across the Islamic world. This was not just adoption, it was an improvement. Paper makers refined techniques, introduced new materials, and expanded production. Paper mills appeared in cities like Baghdad and Damascus. Paper began replacing parchment across the region. It also played a key role in preserving and transmitting knowledge during the Islamic Golden Age. Eventually, paper reached Europe by the 12th century, and at first it was met with skepticism, but that wouldn't last long.
You know, I think before we get into Europe and the printing revolution, I think we should take a small break. What do you think?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, we'll be right back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Have you thought about what you're getting your mom for Mother's Day? At Cozy Earth, they have a full line of apparel, PJs, shirts, socks, you name it, they have it. And if you buy any of their bedding, they have a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty, free shipping on orders over $50 or more. And our listeners get an exclusive discount of 21% off just by using our code INFOGO at checkout. And you can do that at cozyearth.com. Find the link and the code in the show notes. If you're laying mulch, bedding animals, covering seeds, or just want your property looking right, there's one name you need to know. Irwin Farms, Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. When it comes to quality wheat straw, it matters. Clean, consistent, and ready to work because they don't cut corners, they bale it. Whether you're a homeowner, gardener, farmer, or you're just getting your hands dirty for the first time, they've got you covered. You can find the link in the show notes. Just Google Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. Either way, you'll find Irwin Farms. So now that we're back, paper arrived in Europe at exactly the right moment, like dry kindling waiting for a spark, right?
Mhm.
So by the 15th century, Europe was already changing. Trade networks, they were expanding. Cities were growing, universities were starting to form. There was increasing demand for books, especially religious texts like the Bible, legal documents, and classical works. But there was also a bottleneck because books were still copied by hand, often by scribes working in monasteries. A single manuscript could take months to reproduce. Parchment was made from animal skins, and it was durable, but it was really expensive. Processing one large book could require the hides of dozens of animals. So, this made books rare, and knowledge, well, it made it slow to the people.
The people.
The people.
So the people need education too?
Well, I mean, this is an unhinged time, according to you.
It is. It is an unhinged time. And the knowledge to the people was very much
It's alien. Oh, wait. It's witchcraft.
witchcraft.
Yeah.
Witchcraft at the time.
It's witchery. It's sorcery.
Only disseminated by a few people because only a few people could read at the time. So there's that.
Hey, put them in the Duncan chair. If they drowned, they're not a witch. If they don't drown, they're a witch, so drown them.
Right. Either
Is
way.
that how it works?
something like that.
Okay.
So then came along Johannes Gutenberg. By the mid 1400s, Gutenberg introduced a system that combined several innovations into one process: movable metal type oil based ink and a screw press adapted from wine and olive presses.
So, China actually invented printing before the Gutenberg press?
Yes, with their
Just
wood blocks and everything else like that, they printed before the printing press.
okay.
Factoid.
Anyway, that's all I was trying to say.
Instead of carving entire pages, though, individual letters could be cast in metal, arranged into words and sentences, inked, pressed onto a surface, and then reused to create new pages.
So, this is where the letter J really came into play, right? The letter J, remember how we were talking about, when the printing press came along, I, there was only the I and then the
That's
letter
right.
J.
The letter J was created from the letter I to make it less confusing while printing.
Yes, so the printing press really helped evolve the letter J.
It
And if you
did.
want to know what we're talking about, go listen to our episode, A Dash. We'll just move on from here.
But the system depended on one crucial component. It needed a material that could absorb ink consistently, withstand pressure, and be produced in large quantities.
Guess what that material would be? Paper.
Paper.
Paper was, well, it was cheaper than parchment and faster to produce. European paper mills, already operating by this time, well, they could supply growing demand, unlike parchment, which required, well, animals and to be processed into, you know, parchment because you had to take the hide and do all that other stuff with it. Paper relied on fiber-based materials, and this could be scaled more easily than, well, animal hides. Technically, paper also performed better for printing. Its slightly rough fiber surface, well, it allowed ink to, well, adhere evenly without extensive smearing. It could handle the pressure of the press without tearing when, poorly made. Could you imagine getting your parchment book and then you go to touch it and then it just smears and you're like, what? I can't figure out what the end is. It's all smeared up. Like you're at the end of the book and, parchment, it smears the ink where paper does not. You get your book and you're all at the end of it and you want to know how it ends, but it's all
And you
smeared.
can't because it's all smudged.
Yeah. And then you're like, I want my money back. And they're like, yeah, bro, you're not getting it back. Sorry. Buy another one.
Indeed, and it was mostly a trade system, so maybe you had something better to trade.
Anyway, yeah. Can I get a paper copy of this? Paperback, I guess, was probably the big thing back in the day.
Or a leather bound.
Yeah. Anyway,
Books that once existed as single copies could now be produced in hundreds, then thousands. The cost of books began to fall. Access increased. Access to literature increased, not for everyone immediately, but enough to begin shifting society. Literacy started to rise, especially in urban areas, which is a big thing back in the day.
mm, very big thing. Religious texts were among the first to be widely printed, and the Bible, in particular, became more accessible, which had profound consequences because individuals could read and interpret text themselves rather than relying entirely on clergy, which is probably why you've heard of the Gutenberg Bible. And scientific ideas also began to circulate more widely. Observations, experiments, and theories could be recorded, shared, and challenged across, well, distances, not just locally.
Not just locally.
Like you and I couldn't just have a conversation, like we could put it on a podcast and spread it across the globe.
That sounds insane.
It does until you look at where all we're at. We're in 78 countries. It's crazy.
Yes.
All right.
I'm excited to be global, even if it's not physically global.
Yeah.
Okay, so political arguments found new life in printed pamphlets and essays. Ideas about governance, rights, and society could spread beyond local communities. Literature expanded as well. Stories, poetry, and plays reached broader audiences, helping to shape shared culture. Paper enabled all of this. It wasn't just the surface that held the ink, it was the medium that allowed information to scale. So, for the first time in European history, knowledge could be reproduced faster, that it could be suppressed. And that really changed everything.
Paper became the backbone of an early information network, centuries before electricity or the internet. It carried ideas across borders, across classes, and across generations. Long before the digital age, there was already an information revolution. It was built on ink, pressed into paper.
By the 19th century, demand for paper had outgrown traditional materials like rags. The solution came from trees. Wood pulp paper transformed production. Instead of relying on recycled cloth, manufacturers could use abundant timber. Mechanical and chemical processes broke wood down into fibers, which were then turned into paper at a massive scale. This really marked a turning point. Paper became cheaper than ever, production became faster and more consistent. Availability expanded globally. Newspapers exploded in popularity, books became affordable, packaging, advertising, and documentation all expanded. Paper was no longer just a specialized material, it was everywhere.
So, long before modern banking systems, carrying wealth meant carrying weight. Value was tied directly to physical materials, usually metal. Coins were made of copper, silver, gold, and it was standard across much of the world. They were durable, widely trusted, but they came with a practical problem. They were heavy. Large transactions required large quantities of coins. Moving wealth over long distances, well, it was slow, expensive, and, well, quite frankly, risky. Merchants had to think not just about profit, but about transport, storage, and security. In China, this problem became especially clear as trade expanded during the Tang Dynasty. Merchants began using a workaround. Instead of carrying coins, they would deposit them with a trusted agent and receive a written note representing their value. These notes could then be redeemed later.
At first, this system was informal. It relied on personal trust and reputation, but over time, the idea evolved. By the Song Dynasty, the government began issuing official paper money. These early banknotes were standardized and backed by state authority, making them more reliable than private notes. This was a major shift. For the first time, value is being represented rather than physically embodied. The paper itself had little inherent worth, but it stood in for something that did. It allowed trade to expand more efficiently. Large sums could be transported without physical burden. Transactions became faster and more flexible, but this system introduced a new dependency: trust.
Trust, because the people had to believe that that paper could be exchanged for real value. They had to trust the authority issuing it. If that trust failed, well, so did the system. This concept, well, it slowly spread out of China. It spread into Europe, where metallic currency had long dominated. Paper money was initially viewed, well, with suspicion because what's it valued? Gold, silver, well, it had tangible value. It could be melted down, traded, or weighed. Paper, by comparison, it seemed fragile and uncertain because it could just go up in flames, right? Early experiments with paper money in Europe were often unstable. Over insurance, lack of regulation, weak backing, well, it led to inflation and loss of confidence all across Europe. But the advantages, they were difficult to ignore.
Paper money was easier to carry, easier to count, and easier to standardize. As banking systems developed and governments strengthened their control over currency, confidence gradually increased. By the modern era, paper currency had become a central part of global economies. Interestingly enough, though, modern paper money is not made from standard wood pulp paper. Instead, it is typically produced using a blend of cotton and linen fibers. This gives it greater strength, flexibility, and resistance to wear. It can be folded thousands of times without breaking and can withstand handling in ways ordinary paper cannot.
If you try to fold paper like a couple of hundred times, eventually you're going to get those seams in there and it's just going to rip, right?
Yes.
Some countries have even moved to polymer-based notes, further extending durability and security. But regardless of the material, the principle, well, it's the same. Paper money works because people believe it works. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it, you can't melt it down, you can't build with it or use it as a raw material. In this way, it's meaningless. Its power comes from a collective agreement. It represents value because of a system backed by the government and institutions just because they say it's valuable. In that sense, paper money is one of the closest examples of abstract thinking made physical. It is trust you can hold. And like all systems built on trust, its strength really depends on how firmly that belief is maintained. So, for every dollar you have in your pocket, you believe that it's worth what the government says it's worth.
Right.
It's kind of scary, ain't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's going to be what you're about to talk about.
It might be. I may slide in there just a little bit.
Okay.
So, toilet paper is so standard today that it feels like it has always existed. I've got news for you though. It hasn't. Okay. Historically,
No.
people at all. Okay.
Terrarium?
Oh man, the sponge on a stick. Hopefully they had some vinegar, but sometimes they didn't, and yeah, you could clearly see the parasites moving on
Oh
said
my
sponge.
gosh, just keep going.
So anyway, historically, people used whatever was available: leaves, moss, corn cobs, water, cloth. In China, paper was used for hygiene as early as the 6th century, but large-scale production didn't begin until the 19th century. In the United States, companies like Scott Paper Company began selling toilet paper commercially in the late 1800s. At first, it was marketed as a medical product rather than a comfort item, but over time, it became softer, more refined, and more widely available. Urbanization played a key role. As cities grew, hygiene became more important and standardized solutions became necessary. Toilet paper is one of the clearest examples of paper shifting from intellectual use to everyday necessity.
Thank God for toilet paper because corn cobs just sound horrible.
I don't know what I'd do without toilet paper.
Yeah, definitely not using that terrarium.
Mm-mm.
Sit in a creek or something. I don't know. Just
That would be better.
don't be downstream. Paper towels emerged in the early 20th century. Their origins is often described as, well, accidental. A batch of paper was produced too thick for toilet paper, and instead of discarding it, it was repurposed. The result was a disposable towel. So paper towels became popular in schools, hospitals, kitchens because they offered a hygienic alternative to a reusable cloth. They reduced the spread of germs and simplified cleaning. This marketed another evolution in paper's role, from reusable medium to disposable convenience. Paper no longer was just something you kept, it was something you used once and then you just threw it away.
So today, paper exists in this strange balance. You have digital technology, which has replaced many of its traditional roles: emails instead of letters, digital books instead of printed ones, online banking instead of physical currency, and
Hey,
yet
before you go on, so when you get a handwritten letter, you feel special, right?
I do feel special.
Yeah, because I mean, we used to get handwritten letters all the time. And I have an uncle that writes handwritten letters, and when I get one from him, I'm like, "Oh wow, this is makes me feel so special that somebody took the time out of their day to write something other than just texting it or emailing it or whatever."
Paper still remains, right? It persists in areas where permanence, trust, or simplicity matter. Legal documents, currency, packaging, hygiene products. Paper has adapted before, and it continues to adapt now. It began as plant fibers suspended in water. It became the foundation of knowledge, trade, communication, and daily life. And even in a world of screens, it hasn't disappeared, because sometimes the simplest materials are the hardest to replace. Paper does not demand attention. It just simply works, and it always has.
Paper is often remembered as a tool of knowledge, bureaucracy, and commerce, but it also found itself in one of history's most disruptive technologies, gunpowder. Because gunpowder depends on a very unique need. You must contain it, measure it, and deliver it in a controlled amount. Loose powder is dangerous and inefficient. It burns too quickly and unpredictably. Paper? Well, it solved part of that problem.
Only part of it, though. By the time gunpowder weapons began spreading across Europe and other regions, paper had become a standard material for packaging and construction. It was cheap, flexible, and easy to shape into small containers. Early firearms often used paper in the form of cartridges. A measured amount of gunpowder would be wrapped in paper, sometimes along with a projectile. The soldier would bite, tear, or open the paper, pour the charge, and load the weapon in a standardized sequence.
This made firing faster and more consistent. It also turned paper into a battlefield material, not just as an administrative or commercial one. But this dependence created an unexpected vulnerability because during major conflicts, especially in large scale industrial wars, armies consumed enormous quantities of ammunition cartridges. And those cartridges, well, they required enormous quantities of paper.
In the American Civil War, this became especially noticeable. The Confederate states in the South faced several industrial shortages compared to the North. One of those shortages was paper. As the war intensified, Southern supply lines struggled not only with metal, weapons, and food, but also with something far more ordinary the raw materials needed to produce paper at scale. Rags, cotton waste, and other fiber sources were diverted toward military needs. Paper mills could not keep up with demand. At times, shortages of paper directly affected the production of ammunition cartridges. So, in practical terms, an army that could not produce enough cartridges could not sustain firing rates. And in a war where industrial output increasingly determined battlefield strength, something as simple as paper became strategically important.
And this created a strange paradox. The same material that enabled communication, currency, and education was now also part of the logistics of warfare. Paper had become infrastructure, not just for ideas, but for force. And like many quiet technologies, its importance, well, it was most visible not when it was abundant, but when it began to run out. So by this point, paper is no longer just a material, right? It is no longer just a tool for writing, packaging, or commerce. It has become infrastructure. And like all infrastructure that scales across societies, it begins to shape who holds power and how that power is maintained.
Because paper does something subtle but profound, it turns information into something that can be stored, duplicated, and enforced. Once that happens, control over paper becomes control over reality on record. Governments rely on it to define citizens, track land ownership, enforce taxation, and record laws. Without paper, these systems would collapse into oral memory and local interpretation, which I don't know if you ever played the telephone game, but it kind of
Yeah, it's kind of the
doesn't
same. Like,
doesn't really end too great.
no.
So, with paper, they became standardized and portable. A ruling written in one place can govern another place entirely.
So religious institutions use it in a similar way. Sacred text, once copied and preserved in limited quantities, well, they became reproducible. That changed not only access but interpretation. When text can be widely distributed, authority shifts from exclusive custody to broader readership, and sometimes to a disagreement. In commerce, paper enables contracts between strangers. It allows agreements to exist outside of memory. A promise becomes something that can outlast the people who made it. Trade expands because trust no longer has to be personal. It can be written, stored, and enforced later. But the moment information becomes reproducible, other forces appear alongside it.
Control. Because paper does not simply store truth, it stores whatever is written onto it. And that means societies quickly develop systems to decide what counts as valid paper and what does not. Signatures, seals, official stamps, specialized inks, embossed marks, and eventually watermarks all emerge for one reason to separate authentic documents from forgeries. This creates a quiet tension running through the paper's history. The same material that enables trust also enables forgery. The same system that stabilizes economies also creates new opportunities for deception. Paper becomes a battleground not of force, but of verification. And at the same time, paper begins to accumulate another role memory.
Because not human memory, which kind of, it fades and shifts because your truth may be different from somebody else's. But when it's written and preserved, well, you can't really change it, right? Laws, histories, inventories, your genealogy, scientific observations, all of these, well, they begin to exist outside the human mind because It can be written down and stored. And this changes something fundamental. For the first time, civilizations can outlast individual memory at scale. Knowledge no longer depends entirely on who is alive, who can be archived, who can be referenced or stored. But this also introduces a new question. If everything can be recorded, what is worth recording?
A lot of things.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, nowadays we take it for granted, but back in the day, I think that was probably a pretty big question.
Right.
Because paper it's not just a neutral storage, right? It's just a way to store it. It's a way, because even though you're recording it, you're still filtering it into your thought, right?
And that filtering power extends into politics, education, and culture. Whoever controls the production, distribution, or preservation of paper controls a significant portion of what a society remembers about itself. This is why paper mills, printing presses, archives, and later publishing houses became powerful institutions in their own right. They're not just industrial centers, they are gatekeepers of information flow. Even as technology advances, this structure remains recognizable. And then eventually, paper begins to face its most modern transformation. Not disappearance, but displacement.
And that brings us to digital systems because that replicates paper's core functions. Documents become files, letters become messages, ledgers become spreadsheets, archives become databases. The structure remains, but the material, well, it changed. Yet, even here, paper does not vanish. It persists in places where physicality still matters: legal contracts, official documents, currency, personal notes, physical books, packaging, forms that require a signature. It remains where trust, permanence, or tactile certainty still hold weight.
Paper survives because it does something digital systems still struggle to fully replace. It exists independently of power, electricity, and infrastructure once created. A sheet of paper does not need a network. It does not need a device. It simply is. And so, after thousands of years of evolution, paper remains what it has always been at its core: a way to turn thought into something that can travel, a way to make memory external, a way to let information outlive the moment it was created. Not alive, not intelligent, not powerful on its own, but capable of carrying the shape of civilization itself.
There is no other way to hold a book and read it. I mean, yeah, I still like the digital forms, having it read to me, whatever, but I still like to pick up my books and physically hold them and read them and look at them.
I only really have time to listen to books, but at some point when I build bookshelves in my house, I will have trophy books or the
Trophy
ones I've
books.
listened to, the ones that I've listened to.
Not that you've read.
Not that I've picked up and read, okay, but I do enjoy the physical book. I love going to Barnes and Noble and looking at their decorative like editions of I have the Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven.
I have Edgar Allan Poe's complete works in like this limited edition hardback, and I have
Mhm.
all of Shakespeare's edition. And
I
yeah,
need
I
to
mean,
get Shakespeare's, but I do have Edgar Allan Poe's, and it's a black and red like filigree copy. It's hardback also. It's beautiful.
but yeah, I mean, paper. Anyway, that's all I have about paper.
Me too. If you would like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
If you want to help us keep the show going, you can do so at Patreon or snag a deal from one of our sponsors. Either way, you can find those links in the show notes.
And as always, William and I want to thank you for listening.
Whether you've been with us from day one or just tuning in, Kat and I say thank you for keeping us going.
Join the Facebook group at Info on the Go
Over there, you can get to know us.
or ask us a question.
But whatever you do, make sure you hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Send us fan mail using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
Leaving a review on Apple Podcasts really does help others find us. And if you write it, Kat and I'll read it. But you can email Kat and myself directly
Info on the Go podcast at gmail.com.
and you can find all of those links in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.
If your stomach's been off lately, like bloating, reflux, or just not feeling right, there's a simpler way to get back on track.
With Professor B's Digestive Aid, which is an all natural blend of pure honey and ancient apitherapy, a herb rooted in Roman tradition. You know how at least they had some things right, right? It's designed to gently support and balance your digestion.
No long ingredient list, no harsh additives, just two powerful, time tested ingredients working together. It's even the same formula used to help cancer patients manage digestive discomfort.
And right now, you can get an exclusive 10% off any product. Just use our code INFOGO at checkout.